Back in the 2000s, movies were just different. It was a golden era where you actually had to choose which masterpiece to see in theaters because the market was flooded with quality. Filmmakers were obsessed with originality and craft, all just to chase that Academy Award nomination. Now, some say that shady power players basically bought their way to the Academy, lobbying critics just to push their projects. But despite the corruption, you can't deny that the average quality of films back then was leagues ahead of what we're getting today. Movie theaters weren't just mass entertainment factories. The DVD market ruled the industry. Because of that, a lot of brilliant films flopped at the box office, only to earn their cult classic status years later. But then, the 2000s arrived, bringing an endless expansion of sequels, prequels, and men in green spandex. DVD carriers died out, and studios became desperate for quick cash. I get it, it's just business. But what I can't wrap my head around is the modern audience. We are fueling this movie centipede of repetitive cookie-cutter garbage. We keep paying for the same recycled trash, and the studios keep serving it up. Today we're looking back at 10 films that were completely overlooked when they first hit theaters. But just like a fine wine, they only got better with age eventually reaching cult classic status. But before we jump in, if you love deep dives into cinema history, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate the support.
Where's the money, Lebowski?
Coming in at number 10, we have The Big Lebowski. Today, the dude is a pop culture icon, and there's even an entire philosophy dedicated to his lifestyle. But when this hit theaters back in 1998, it was a complete disaster. The critics were baffled, and general audiences just didn't get it. They were expecting a straight-up comedy, but instead, they got a surreal, winding crime noir parody that was way ahead of its time. People walked out of theaters scratching their heads, wondering why they just spent 2 hours watching a guy in a bathrobe drink White Russians. It wasn't bad, it was just too weird for the mainstream. It took years for the world to catch up, but today it's arguably the most quotable comedy ever made. The audiences didn't get Where's Money, but we definitely get it now. This movie had a $15 million budget and it barely scraped together $46 million worldwide at the time. Critics were confused, audiences were indifferent, and it just didn't land. But fast forward to today, it holds a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes and is universally recognized as a masterpiece. Coming in at number 9, we have American Psycho. Today, Patrick Bateman is a literal icon of internet culture, fueling endless memes and deep dive video essays. But back in 2000, most people just didn't get the point. The studio originally wanted Leonardo DiCaprio for the role, but he didn't want to play a villain at the time, so the part eventually went to Christian Bale. Made on a tight $7 million budget, the movie grossed about $34 million. It wasn't a massive flop, but it definitely wasn't a hit either. Critics were split. Some called it a brilliant satire, while others just dismissed it as tasteless, boring violence. They completely missed the point. They thought it was just another slasher movie, when in reality it was a razor-sharp critique of 80s yuppie culture, vanity, and the void inside the modern man. It's sitting at a 7.6 on IMDb now, and it's arguably one of the most culturally significant films of the decade. It took the world about 20 years to finally understand that Bateman wasn't a hero. He was a mirror. And back then, nobody wanted to look in it. Coming in at number 8, we have a film that is now considered one of the best animated movies ever made, The Iron Giant. But back in 1999, it was a box office disaster. The studio poured $70 million into this project, but they were so afraid it would fail that they basically refused to market it. It only grossed about $31 million worldwide, which is just insane when you look at the quality. Critics actually gave it great reviews. It's sitting at a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, but the general audience just ignored it. People thought it was just another kid's movie about a robot, completely missing the deep anti-war message and the incredible emotional weight of the story. It wasn't until it hit DVD and started airing on cable TV that people realized they'd ignored a masterpiece. Today it's a cult legend that makes grown men cry, but back then it was just another flop the studio wanted to forget. At number 7, we have Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The studio threw a massive $85 million budget at Edgar Wright expecting a summer blockbuster. It ended up grossing only about $48 million worldwide, a total disaster by Hollywood standards. The issue was that the marketing tried to sell it as a standard teen comedy, but the movie itself was a fast-paced video game-inspired fever dream that was light years ahead of its time. Critics loved the energy, giving it an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes, but the average theatergoer was just confused by the breakneck editing and comic book visuals. It took years for the internet to catch up to its aesthetic. Today it's a cult classic that defined the visual language of the 2000s. It wasn't a flop because it was bad, it was a flop because the world wasn't online enough to understand it yet. At number 6, we have the visually stunning Blade Runner 2049. When it was released, the film received a surprisingly lukewarm reception. The studio poured a massive $150 to $185 million into this, and it barely managed to bring in $260 million worldwide. Once you factor in marketing and theater cuts, it was a massive financial loss. People were expecting a fast-paced sci-fi action movie, but instead, they got a slow, meditative, 3-hour piece of philosophical art. Critics were blown away, giving it an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes, but general audiences felt that 164 minutes was just too much for a sequel they weren't sure they wanted. It was too smart, too quiet, and too beautiful for the popcorn-chasing crowd. Over the years, it's earned its spot as one of the best sci-fi films of the century. It didn't find its audience in theaters, but it definitely found it in history. At number 5, we have the chaotic surreal masterpiece, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. If you watch it today, it feels like a drug-fueled descent into the soul of the American dream. But back in 1998, audiences were completely repulsed by it. The film cost around $18.5 million to make, but it barely made $10.6 million at the domestic box office. It was a certified financial disaster. Critics were tearing it apart, calling it a repulsive, messy, and aimless experience. They expected a coherent story, but instead they got a wild, hallucinations-filled trip that refused to follow any rules of traditional storytelling. It holds a 50% rating on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, which is honestly shocking because, over the years, the film found its true home among fans. It became the ultimate cult classic, quoted endlessly, and loved for its unapologetic weirdness. It wasn't designed to be liked, it was designed to be experienced. At number 4, we have Alfonso Cuarón's masterpiece, Children of Men. If you watch it today, it feels less like a movie and more like a documentary from the future. But back in 2006, the world just wasn't ready to face the brutal reality it was showing. The studio bet $76 million on this vision, but it barely brought in $70 million worldwide. It was a financial flop that actually pushed Cuarón into a career hiatus. Why? Because audiences were looking for escapism, and they got a gritty, depressing, and all too real look at humanity's collapse. It wasn't the fun sci-fi blockbuster people wanted. Critics recognized it as a technical marvel. Those long takes are legendary, but it struggled to find an audience in theaters. Now it holds an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, and its reputation has only grown with time. It turns out that when a film is too honest about the world, people don't want to see it, until the world actually starts to look like the film. At number 3, we have the film that sits at the very top of the IMDb charts today, The Shawshank Redemption. It's hard to believe, but back in 1994, this movie was considered a total commercial failure. With a $25 million budget, it barely managed to pull in $28 million during its initial run. It was completely overshadowed by the massive hype surrounding Forrest Gump and Pulp Fiction. People just didn't want to see a prison drama during a summer of blockbusters. It didn't win a single Oscar despite 7 nominations. Critics liked it, but audiences just stayed home. It wasn't until it hit television and cable networks that people actually gave it a chance. And once they did, they fell in love. It went from being a box office flop to becoming the most beloved film in the world. Coming in at number 2, we have Zack Snyder's Watchmen. You know, some say if you cut out all the slow motion, the movie would only be 20 minutes long. But jokes aside, in 2009, the world wasn't quite ready for a superhero movie this cynical, violent, and morally gray. The studio gambled big with a $130 million budget, but it only pulled in about $185 million worldwide. After marketing costs, it was a major disappointment. While comic book fans worshipped the source material, the general audience found it confusing and exhausting. They were expecting your typical blockbuster, but instead they got a deep philosophical story about Cold War paranoia and what happens when heroes are actually broken, dangerous people. Critics were deeply divided, giving it a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, but over the years, the film's reputation has skyrocketed. Today it's recognized as a visual masterpiece, a daring adaptation that refused to compromise. And finally, at number 1, we have the film that defined a generation, Fight Club. It's hard to imagine now, but when it hit theaters in 1999, it was a massive flop that almost killed David Fincher's career. With a $63 million budget, it only brought in $37 million domestically. The studio was terrified. They didn't know how to market it, and critics absolutely hated it, calling it repulsive and irresponsible. Audiences were confused by the dark twist, and the movie left theaters almost as quickly as it arrived. It was too angry, too nihilistic, and way too ahead of its time for a society that wasn't ready to hear that you are not your job. But then came the DVD era. The film found its true audience, and it exploded. Today, it has an 88% on Rotten Tomatoes and an 8.8 on IMDb. It became a cultural touchstone that millions of people still quote daily. It proves that the best art doesn't always need an immediate thumbs up from the box office. Sometimes it needs time to break the system. And that, more than anything, is the true legacy of Fight Club. So what does this tell us? Well, it's a good reminder that greatness isn't always measured in opening weekend numbers. Sometimes a masterpiece just needs a little time to find the right audience. Whether it was the marketing, the timing, or just a world that wasn't ready for the message, all these films eventually got the respect they deserved. But now, I want to hear from you. Which of these movies do you think was the most unfairly treated by the audience back in the day? Did I miss any other flops that turned into absolute cult classics? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this trip through cinema history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of film. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.